Hello again, it's Granny up in her bedroom again, and I'm going to read you another one from the big book of short stories. Gather Lachlan enjoyed the last one, The Ghost of Codlin Castle. So let's try this one. It's called Philibert the First. And there's the picture, big castle there. Felicia was a wonderful country. Every Monday was a bank holiday, and no one worked on a day with an S in it, which just left Friday. It never rained in the daytime, but only at night. There were no traffic problems because everyone rode about, very slowly, on donkeys. And there were no schools. If you wanted to know something, you asked your mum or dad. And if they didn't know how many beans make 5, then neither would you. Finally, even if they didn't always actually love their neighbours, Felicians were always nice to one another, so that everyone was happy, except the king. King Philibert the First of Felicia had everything anyone could want. He had his health and strength, he had a beautiful wife, and 3 handsome sons and 3 pretty daughters, and a magnificent palace, and loads of servants and pots of money, and a pet walrus called Norman. What more could any man desire? Yet King Philibert had become unhappy, and not a single Felician knew the reason why, not even the Queen. "Philibert," she would say each day, "why are you unhappy?" And each day the King would reply, "I'm sorry, my dear, but I do not know." "You do still love me, don't you?" the Queen would say, and the King would answer, "Yes, my dear, I do." But oh, how sadly he said it. It was the same with the little princes and princesses. On Fridays, those that could read studied the Encyclopaedia Felicianica, and those that could only weed worked in the palace gardens. But on every other day they too asked their father, "Why are you unhappy, Papa?" And the King would reply, "I'm sorry, my children, I wish I knew why." Everyone else wished so too, because all of them, right down to the poorest beggar in the streets of the capital, Felicity, were as happy as larks, while their king was as miserable as sin, with a face as long as a boot. Only one living creature in Felicia looked as sad as King Philibert, and that was his pet walrus, Norman. Norman was 12 feet long and so fat that he weighed 1.5 tons. Some Felicians on an expedition to Greenland had brought him back as a 50th birthday present for the king. Norman's favourite food was oysters, and every morning King Philibert would feed him dozens of them, except when there was an R in the month, and then Norman had to make do with mussels. And every morning the king would pat the walrus on top of his huge, round, bald head and say sadly, "There, was that nice?" And in reply, Norman would give a deep, gurgly moan that sounded like gloom. Then the king and his pet walrus would stare sorrowfully at one another, the very picture of unhappiness. And there they are, staring at one another, looking very unhappy. Can't think why they've got so much to be unhappy about. Maybe we'll find out. "I never can decide," said the Queen to the little princes and princesses, "which looks the more miserable, the king or the walrus." She had, of course, often consulted the royal doctor about the king's condition, but though he had suggested dieting and exercise and hot and cold baths, and even taking the day off on Fridays, nothing had worked. Even the court jester's funniest jokes could raise no smile on the face of King Philibert the First of Felicia. One morning, as the king finished feeding his walrus with oysters, he said with a sigh, "Very soon, Norman, I shall be 51, and then it will be a whole year since first you arrived, and since last I smiled." "Gloom," answered Norman. And gloom there was a day or so later, for the walrus was suddenly taken ill with the stomachache. To the one usual word he spoke was added another. "Doom," moaned Norman, "doom." Feeling sadder than ever, the king sent for the royal vet. Now it so happened that the royal vet was newly appointed and had never before set eyes on King Philibert, let alone on Norman. "What seems to be the trouble, Your Majesty?" he asked politely. "It's Norman," said the king sadly. "He has the tummy ache, poor fellow. This morning he actually refused his food." "What food, sire?" asked the royal vet. "Oysters, of course." "In the 2nd week of May?" asked the royal vet. "Oh, help," said King Philibert. "I was thinking it was still April. There's no R in this month." "Exactly," said the royal vet. "No wonder he has the tummy ache." "Doom," groaned Norman. "We'll soon put him right," said the royal vet. "Starve him for a couple of days and then switch to mussels, and he'll be as right as rain." And there's the vet, listening to Norman's tummy with the stethoscope. The king sighed. The royal vet looked carefully at his royal master. "Forgive me, sire," he said, "if I say that you do not look as happy as the average Felician. In fact, you do not look happy at all. In fact, you look downright wretched." "I am," said King Philibert. "Soon it will be a whole year since I last smiled." The royal vet looked extremely thoughtful. "How long, may I ask," he said, "has Your Majesty kept this walrus as a pet?" "Almost a year," said the king. "He was a 50th birthday present, and soon I shall be 51. "That's it," cried the royal vet. "That's what?" cried the king. "Gloom," moaned the walrus. "Norman," said the royal vet, "is the cause of Your Majesty's unhappiness. Looking at Norman's gloomy face has made you gloomy too." "Must I get rid of them then?" said the king. "Must Norman go?" "No, no, sire," said the royal vet. "What we must do is to turn Norman into a happy walrus, and I think I know how to do this." "How?" asked the king. "Leave it to me, Your Majesty," said the royal vet. So King Philibert left it to him. Thus it was that some months later another expedition arrived back from Greenland with another present for the king. It was another walrus, much like Norman to look at, but smaller. When he saw it, King Philibert looked even sadder than usual. "If one walrus makes me miserable," he said, "what will two do?" But Norman didn't look sadder than usual. Norman didn't look as sad as usual at all. His dull, fishy eyes suddenly lit up at the sight of the new walrus. His moustache bristled. His mournful expression turned into a kind of grin. Then he opened his mouth, and out of it came not the usual gloom or doom, but a happy, excited, roaring noise that sounded like vroom, vroom, as he lumbered forward to touch noses with the newcomer. "He likes him," said King Philibert. "He likes her, you mean," said the royal vet. "Oh," said the king, "I see. You mean—" "I mean, Your Majesty," said the royal vet, "that from now on Norman will be a different animal. Just look at him." And King Philibert looked at his happy walrus, and a great smile spread over his face. Then he began to chuckle, and then he began to laugh so loudly that the queen and the 3 little princes and the 3 little princesses and all the members of the royal household came running to see what on earth had happened. There's 2 walruses meeting. They're giving each other a kiss. Oh, what joy there was throughout the land of Felicia as the glad news of the king's recovery became known. Happy as the people had thought themselves before, now they were even happier, especially when they learned that in celebration a royal decree had been issued, forbidding anyone to work on Fridays. "Oh, Philibert," said the queen when at last they were alone together, "you do still love me, don't you?" "Yes, my dear," said King Philibert the First of Felicia. "I am very, very glad to say I do. Without the shadow of a doubt, we shall live happily ever after." And they did. Sometimes all you need is another person to help you be happy in life. I hope you enjoyed that one. We'll be reading another one shortly, and I will send it to you. Cheerio for now. Bye.